It's a story that we're all pretty familiar with. It's actually a story that's told in 3 of the 4 gospel accounts. We typically look at it from the account in Matthew because when Matthew tells this story about Jesus walking on the water, he includes the part where Peter gets out of the boat and walks on the water, and then he takes his eyes off Jesus and starts to sink, and we usually focus on that part of the story. But the other writers kind of include some different perspectives on it, and Mark is the one that I want us to look at this morning because there's something in here, and it's really simple, and it's really easy for us to miss, I think, sometimes, and I think it's something that we need to be reminded about. It's something that we intellectually know, and it's something we intellectually understand about Jesus and who he is and how he works in our lives, but I think sometimes we tend to forget because of circumstances and because of things that come up in our lives. So I just want to read this story real quick. It starts in verse 45 of Mark chapter 6. And as we read the story, I want you to just, as we think through this morning, kind of put yourself in the shoes of the apostles, the shoes of the disciples. Actually, they're sandals, if you will. They didn't wear shoes, but are in the boat, because that's where they are this night. Put yourselves in the boat as one of these disciples. You know, we just sung a song, "I'll be a friend to Jesus." And that's a neat song, and it's a neat thought to be a friend of Jesus. Well, this morning we're going to look at what happened, a real-life example of something that happened to his friends while he was here on this earth, and I want us to think about it from their perspective. In verse 45, it says, and this is just after he's fed the 5,000, did the great miracle, and they had leftover. It says in verse 45, immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side to Bethsaida, while he himself was sending the crowd away. And bidding them farewell, he left for the mountain to pray. When it was evening, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. Seeing them straining at the oars, for the wind was against them, at about the 4th watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea, and he intended to pass by them. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed that it was a ghost, and they cried out. For they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke with them and said to them, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind stopped, and they were utterly astonished. For they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, but their heart was hardened. Okay. As we said, this is just after the feeding of the 5,000. The disciples have seen an amazing miracle. They've seen the power that Jesus has. And I want you to notice in verse 45, it says, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him. I mean, it almost implies they might have argued or didn't want to go because he made them get in the boat. If you read the other accounts, it basically just says he told them to get in the boat and go to the other side. And they do exactly what he says. They were following orders. They were obeying what he wanted them to do. He said, I'm going to stay here. I'm going to disperse the crowd. I need some time alone. I'm going to go up on the mountain to pray. You guys get in the boat and go on. And they did exactly what he said. Now, in our Christian lives, when we are trying to follow God's will, when we're trying to do what he tells us to do, if he's leading us somewhere or asking us to do a certain thing, and we follow orders, we obey the command, we do what he says, how do we think things should work out from that point on? We kind of think they ought to be pretty smooth, don't we? That if we're doing what he asks us to do, everything ought to be easy. It ought to be smooth sailing looking at this story. But as we see from this story, that's not the case at all times. So that's one thing I want us to keep in mind. Also keep in mind, if you go back to Mark chapter 4, starting in verse 35, they were on another boat ride, and this time Jesus was with them in the boat. And a terrible storm came up, and it's another story we're familiar with, and Jesus was below. He was asleep, and they had to wake him up, and he calmed the storm, and the winds and the waves obeyed him, and they were amazed at that. And he said, "Oh, you of little faith." Okay, so they had already been in a situation where they were in a storm in the middle of the sea or the lake, and Jesus had calmed the storm. Well, in this story, it says there in verse 48, they were straining at the oars, for the wind was against them. If you read the account in John, it tells us that they were about 3 to 4 miles out in the middle of the lake. They'd traveled 3 or 4 miles, and it gives more detail about the storm and what a gale it was, and the wind was a gale force wind, and they just couldn't get anywhere. I mean, they were rowing as hard as they could, and they weren't moving. Okay, so again, putting yourself in their perspective, what do you think the disciples might have been thinking? Okay, and the other thing to keep in mind is it's probably about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning when he finally comes to them. Okay, so he told them in the evening, let's say 6 or 7 o'clock, he said, "You get in a boat, go to the other side." So they're probably thinking, all right, this is going to be a smooth trip. We're going across. Everything's going to be fine. Well, 9 hours later, they're stuck in a storm in the middle of the lake, and Jesus is back on the shore all by himself. And they know that if he was there with them, he could just tell the waves and the wind to stop. What do you think might have been going through their mind? Think they might have been frustrated? Think they might have thought, "Man, I cannot believe it. Why in the world did he make us get in this boat? He knew a storm was coming, and he sent us off all by ourselves, and now he's on the shore. He doesn't even know what's going on. We're helpless. We're stuck. We're alone. We're deserted. We're frustrated. Maybe even a little angry." That might have been, and I guess I only assume that maybe because there have been times in my life when I've tried to do what God wants and I hit a storm. And things come up and I'm rowing against the wind and I can't get anywhere. And it just kind of feels like he doesn't understand, he doesn't see, he doesn't know what's going on in my life. And maybe it's just me, but I think sometimes we all feel that way, that he doesn't know what's going on. And the simple thing I want us to get out of this story is 2 words. Just 2 words that we read over really quickly. Look at verse 48 in Mark chapter 6. It says, seeing them, straining at the oars. Okay? Stop and think about that. Where are they? They're 4 miles out in the middle of a lake. Where's Jesus? He's on the shore. He's up on a mountain praying. Do you think they thought he saw him? No, why would they? I mean, they're a long way from the shore. They're a long way from Jesus. Do we ever feel like we're a long way from God? But he sees us. He sees us, and he saw them. And you might be thinking, man, Ryan, you're making too big a deal out of this. I mean, those are just 2 little words. Yeah, he saw him, but you're kind of making too big a deal out of that. No, that's the story of the Bible. That's what God reveals about himself to us all throughout the Bible, that he sees us. Turn back to Genesis chapter 16. Back to the very first book in the Bible, and one of the very first times that God reveals himself or part of his character through one of his names. And in Genesis chapter 16 is the story of Sarai and Hagar. And if you'll remember, God had promised Abraham and Sarai that they would have a son. And nothing had happened, and they were getting old, and Sarah came up with this idea to just take the maid, and maybe that'll work, and maybe we'll take matters into our own hand, and God's not coming through on what he said he would do, so let's take care of it. So Abraham went along with that, and the plan worked. Hagar conceived, and down in verse 5, Sarah said to Abraham, "May the wrong done to me be upon you. I gave my maid into your arms, but when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her sight. May the Lord judge between you and me." And then Abraham says, do what's good in your sight. He basically kind of lets it go and kind of brushes it off. So then it says, Sarai treated her harshly, and she fled from her presence. We don't have time to go into all the detail, but if you understand the culture that they lived in, and for a maid to be with child and all by herself, that was about the worst situation that a woman could be in that time. Totally helpless, totally hopeless. And she just runs away. Things got so bad that she just left. It says, "Now an angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by a spring on the way to the Shur. And he asked her, 'Hagar, where have you come from and where are you going?'" I think this is interesting. He asked her two questions. One, where did you come from? And number two, where are you headed? Look at her answer. She said, "I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarah." Okay, she answered one of the questions. She said, okay, here's where I'm coming from. But she didn't answer the second question. You know why? She didn't know where she was going. She had no idea what the future held for her. She had no idea where she was going to end up or where she could even go. Do you think she felt alone? Do you think she felt deserted? Do you think she felt like nobody in the world understood her situation? Yeah, and she was. She was helpless and hopeless and alone. But look down in verse 13. After the angel talked to her and told her about the son that she would have and who he would be and all that, in verse 13, she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are a God who sees." For she said, have I even remained alive here after seeing him? What did Hagar learn about God? God saw her. God saw exactly the situation she was in. And she came up with a new name for God. It's kind of cool. El Roi is the name that she gave God. El meaning God, and Roi, R-O-I, meaning a God who sees. She understood that God saw her when it felt like nobody saw her. Let's look at one other example. Turn over to Exodus chapter 3. In Exodus chapter 3, the famous story of Moses and the burning bush. And if you'll remember that the Israelites have been in captivity, they've been in bondage in Egypt just over 400 years at this point. 400 years. Think how many generations that has been in captivity and bondage. And again, put yourself in their position. Do you think they felt like God was looking out for them? Do you think it seemed like God knew what was going on? Probably not after 400 years of bondage. But look at verse 7 of Exodus chapter 3. The Lord said, "I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their sufferings. So I have come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from that land to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey." Okay, what did God tell Moses? I see them. I see what they're going through. I see the circumstances that they're in, and I'm going to do something about it. Okay, I'm sure it didn't seem to them like he did, but he saw what they were going through. Like I said, it's a simple lesson, but it's something we need to be reminded of. God sees every one of our lives. He sees us individually. He sees us as a body of believers. He sees what's going on. He knows where we're at. And the neat part of the story, getting back to Mark chapter 6, if you read the rest of that verse, says, seeing them straining at the oars, for the wind was against them, he came to them, walking on the sea. Okay? And this is really enough for another whole lesson. I'll save it for next time if I ever get to come back. How did Jesus know when to go out to them? I don't know. But he knew exactly the right time, because he was watching them the whole time. And he knew when to go. At just the right time, he saw them straining, and he went to them. And when we think of these stories, and when we think of the fact that Jesus sees us and God sees our circumstances, I think our human response is, well, when's he going to get off the mountain and walk on the water and get here to my boat, because I need some help? Okay, that's our response. Okay, well, in the story of Hagar, he pretty much came immediately. I mean, she conceived and fled, and before she even had the child or before any of that, he came. He took care of her. He met her. Okay, in this story, he waited 6, 7, 8 hours before he came to them and helped them in their boat. In the story of the Israelites, he'd waited 400 years. Okay, I can't tell you when he's going to come to the boat. I wish I could, but I can't. Only he knows when the time is right. But there's one thing I can promise you. It won't be too late. He won't wait too long. 1 Corinthians 10:13 says that he will not allow us to be tempted beyond what we can bear. He won't let us go through things, go through trials, go through sufferings that we can't handle. He won't let it go on for too long. You know, that verse is a wonderful promise that we have from God, that he won't allow us to be tempted beyond what we can bear. And kind of growing up, I always thought of that verse as, you know, he won't allow me to face a temptation, a desire to sin, to do something wrong that's greater than I can say no to. I kind of thought of it that way in terms of, things that we would be tempted to do as kids. I'm tempted to lie about that, or I'm tempted to steal something, or whatever it might be. But my kind of perspective changed that verse a few years ago when I was talking to a guy at our church, Wayne Rogers, who had a wife that had cancer at a very young age, and it eventually took her life. But Wayne said, as he cared for her and as he struggled with all that and wondered how he would take care of the kids or what would happen if she did not beat the cancer, he said that's one verse that he always went to, that he knew that God wouldn't allow him to be tried more than he could bear. It's a promise that we have from God. He won't come too late, and he does see exactly where we are. He sees exactly where every single one of us is. And because we live in a fallen world, a world of sin and a world of struggles and trials, we all have winds and storms in our lives. There are times when we all have to row against the wind, but he's watching, and he knows when it's the right time to come. This morning, you may be in that position and need some help with a situation or a circumstance that's going on in your life. Maybe you need some other Christians to get in the boat with you first and start helping you row against the wind. And that's what the church family is here for. We're going to sing an invitation song here in just a second that will give you the opportunity to come forward if you have any need, or if you know what you need to do to become a child of God, to put him on in baptism and obey him and become a child of God and a friend of Jesus, and you want to start that journey, please come forward as we stand and sing.